Hi, folks. My name is Lee Bidgood. I'm a professor at East Tennessee State University, where I teach Appalachian Studies and Bluegrass, Old Time, and Country Music Studies. And we're joining you this week as part of the International Bluegrass Music Association's World of Bluegrass Conference. This is a panel of new research on bluegrass and string band music. And many thanks to the IBMA staff for working overtime to make this event happen online. Make sure you check out the various things that are going on with the festival on the IBMA website. So today's panel is hosted by the IBMA Foundation. They're a philanthropic organization that supports programs and initiatives fostering the growth of bluegrass music. The foundation helps donors create a legacy for future generations by connecting projects to resources. They support projects that focus on bluegrass music-related arts and culture, education, literary work, and historic preservation. For more info, email info@bluegrassfoundation.org or call 615-260-4807. We're going to start with a presentation from John Duncan. He's a student at Warren Wilson College, majoring in traditional music. He's an old-time musician focusing on the history of fiddle music in the American South. He'll be presenting via video, and we'll start that now.
Good afternoon, IBA. My name is John Duncan. Today I'll be presenting on Fred Cockram and the implications of his influence. So let's get started. I'm going to show you a PowerPoint here on Fred. So here we have Fred. I'm calling this an unsung hero. He very much was an unsung hero. He was overshadowed in his lifetime by Tommy Jarrell, who was known as a darling among the folklorists. And these words, unsung hero, come from Barry Poss, the founder of Sugar Hill Records, who spent a lot of time with Fred in his lifetime. Now, here we have a video of Fred, but I'm not going to be able to show that to you because it, for whatever reason, the virtual connection here is just not great. So I'm going to proceed as though we all saw Fred and clapped our hands and said, oh, that was really great. So this is my thesis. Understanding the musicianship of Appalachian fiddler and banjo player Fred Cockram enhances our appreciation of Southern American roots music because his legacy defies the stereotypes of hillbilly music in its professionalism and artistic merit. Cockram's legacy also provides a critical link in the chain to the African American founders of old time music. So to start, we got to kind of go back to the 18th century. Alan Jabbour, a great scholar and fiddler, well, let me just read this to you. According to Alan Jabbour, there was a cultural curtain dating the last half of the 18th century where fiddle makers sprang up through Europe, democratizing the violin, thereby leading to a new brand of folk music with jigs, reels, and new dance emerging. Jabbour discusses a simultaneity and timing of this revolution where the New World came up with its own musical revolution, leading to a relationship less akin to the New World's music descending from the British Isles, but rather as cultural cousins, whereby the New World's music offered distinct music of its own, influenced by African Americans, Native Americans, Scotch-Irish, and Appalachian commoners. So this is really an interesting topic because this idea of cultural cousins. We always think of our music kind of being inherited from the British Isles and from Africa, but really this fiddle tune boom that happened in the late 18th century sprang up almost simultaneously in England and Ireland and in America. And so they have distinct characteristics. And we'll see more of that as we go on in the slide. So Tommy Jarrell and Fred Cockram were from Round Peak, North Carolina, which borders Virginia. And just to give a little bit of context to their music, we got to kind of go back to the fiddle banjo duet tradition in American music. So in 1678, the banjo is reported in the West Indies. In 1754, the banjo is being played in Maryland. In 1756, fiddle banjo duets were reported in Newport, Rhode Island. So that's kind of cool. And from Joyce Cawthon, musicologist, she explains, accustomed to more complex and varied rhythms than those heard in the British music, the African fiddler may have found the new music childishly simple. He played sedate tunes for his master's cotillions, then added bow shuffles and syncopations to the same tunes to power the rhythmic, emotional, leaping, hand-clapping dances of the slaves. So here we have a connection directly to that bowing influence, the fiddle bowing influence. Here is Fred Cockrum's Natural Bridge Blues, tuned to the key of A, tuned to A, E, A, E. And you can see this bowing chart that shows the direction of his bowing. And you can see that it's highly syncopated, and it has these little rhythmic patterns that are very much influenced by African American tradition. So I'm coining a term for this. It's called short bow fiddlers. Versus, I'm sure we've all heard of long bow fiddlers like John Hartford, Arthur Smith. But here in the historical African American tradition, we're very much so, it's the opposite of longbow fiddlers. So that's why I'm coining the term short bow fiddlers, with like Frank Patterson is a great example from Fraser and Patterson, and John Lusk from Gribble, Lusk, and York. And I put question mark for under longbow fiddlers, because how many African American fiddlers do you know that are longbow fiddlers? I can't name any. And so Cockrum fits into this as a short bow fiddler as well. So from Joyce Cawthon again, this fiddle banjo tradition continued. During the first 100 years of Alabama's settlement and statehood, the black fiddler was enormously important. By the 1930s, fiddling was largely a white institution, and few of the fiddlers interviewed for this book ever recall hearing or knowing black fiddlers. So I know that's a quote from Alabama, but it directly applies to Appalachia as well. And from Kevin Donlevy, he says, it seems reasonable to assume that emancipation would have severed many black slaves from their fiddling and banjo playing, and that countless black players would have seen their slavery as linked to that music. And the advent of the six-string guitar in America, roughly 1900, would allow African American musicians to develop musical idioms of their own, specifically blues and jazz. And we have to mention this blackface minstrelsy. The scar of blackface minstrelsy in the 1800s also played a role in distancing African American musicians from their historical legacy on banjo and fiddle. We could go into that a lot more, but I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with the scar of blackface minstrelsy on our American music legacy. Travis Stewart, professional old-time banjo player, says, I always thought of Cockrum as a blues man rather than simply an old-time musician. I think that's interesting because Fred very much so played very bluesy. If you ever get a hold of his recordings, just check it out. He slides in between every note almost. He gets a lot of microtonality out of his fiddle and his banjo, because his banjo was also fretless. So his bluesy approach to banjo, one surefire way to augment the effect of bluesy playing, remove the frets. This allows freedom to express those in-between notes so critical in African American old-time music. A microtonal approach defies the tempered Western scale and allows for sliding and for expressive dissonance. Expressive dissonance was a staple of round peak music and was utilized freely. So fretted versus fretless banjo playing. Fretted banjo is limited to the expression of the Western tempered scale, of course. You're sort of boxed in. The fretted banjo was not developed until around 1880. So you have to think this legacy that dates back 100 years before that and further was very much expressed on a fretless instrument. So fretless banjo allows for the expression of microtonality characteristic of historical African American fiddling and banjo playing. Take, for example, the recordings of Nathan Frazier. some great fretless banjo playing where he is sliding in between notes, getting microtonality and expressive dissonance. So fretless banjo versus fretted banjo in historical African American recordings. Fretless banjo, like we said, Nathan Frazier from Frazier and Patterson. Fretted banjo would be a lot more common post 1880, but you know, by that point, when we're walking into the 20th century, we're already finding less and less and less African American banjo players and fiddlers. Cockrum's banjo approach. He utilized the dactylic, a rhythmic pattern played on West African instrument, the akonting, known colloquially in America as the bum ditty rhythm, characterized by an 8th note followed by 2 16th notes. It's expressed in the right hand, while the left hand, playing fretless, frequently defies the Western tempered scale. I'm just going to check on our time here, make sure we're doing okay. All right, we've got 10 minutes. Paul Brown, NPR correspondent, was friends with Fred Cockrum and Tommy Jarrell, and he took his mom to go see Fred Cockrum. And this is what his mother was a musician, by the way. So she said, Paul says about this experience, Mom was in heaven on earth. More than once she pointed out to me how Fred was flatting notes by maybe an 1/8 or a quarter note deliberately to get the scream and the whine into the tune. Now this whine is something that is intentional in this music. It's a dissonant flatting of the note, and it expresses itself in what he calls the whine, the round peak whine. So let's go ahead and hear just a little bit of Reuben, which shows some of this whine and this expressive dissonance. It's in 4/4 timing, A-E, in the key of A flat, actually. All right, so let's slow that down to 13th and 14th measure where he does this whine really clearly, which is basically, it's just the first string is being flatted an 8th or quarter note and becomes fully dissonant against the 5th string. So ask yourself, is his intonation off, or is he an artist expressing a series of desired notes? What did we hear? We heard a banjo tune in AAA, A, C sharp, E, and some slight microtonal dissonance and total dissonance, and that distinctive whine that Paul Brown talks about. Now, Adam Hurt, professional banjo player, has a different opinion on Fred's playing. He praises Walt Koken, he praises Fred Cockrum's fiddling, but what he says about Fred's banjo playing is that Fred's banjo playing, on the other hand, has just never grabbed me. The intonation, whether purposeful or inadvertent, grates on my nerves, and the basic tone as well as the abundant overtones of his banjo make it so difficult for me to appreciate the detail in his playing. I find that very interesting. So Walt Koken, revivalist in the 60s and 70s, part of the Highwood String Band, said that he thought Fred's intonation was off on the banjo. But Barry Poss from Sugar Hill Records, who spent a lot of time with Fred, more than anybody, he has a different opinion. He says that saying that Fred's intonation was off is like saying Picasso's lines weren't straight. And there's a picture with Barry and Fred. Now, Brad Leftwich sheds some light on this, and he talks about how the 12-tone scale is an artificial construct, and musicians the world over have come up with different ways of dividing the scale. So it'd be considered ethnocentric to say someone's intonation is off just because they don't observe the same conventions as trained Western commercial musicians. In fact, I'd say one of the main reasons people played fretless banjos in that area is because they couldn't get the notes they wanted to hear on a fretted banjo. They like those in-between notes, blue notes, neutral notes, whatever you want to call them. So just some bio on Fred, and just keeping an eye on our time here. All right, I got 5 minutes. Fred was born in 1905 in Low Gap, North Carolina. That's right near Round Peak, North Carolina. It's within walking distance, actually. He was influenced by his uncle on the fiddle. His uncle played with 2 fingers on the fiddle, and for all you fiddlers out there, if you can imagine playing fiddle with 2 fingers, go for it. He learned Soldier's Joy and Pretty Little Miss from his uncle. His father played banjo, and his biggest influence was Charlie Lowe on banjo. And then on fiddle, his biggest influence was Arthur Smith. And they actually competed together in a fiddle competition, and they tied. And then he ended up going on to get 2nd place against Arthur Smith. So just reiterating what longbow is, longbow tends to refer to playing long bow strokes and playing often more notes per stroke as opposed to the more rhythmic style of, say, Tommy Jarrell. Paul Brown refers to Cockrum as a transitional fiddler, someone who's rooted in tradition but innovates in compelling and creative ways. And even among staunch traditionalists such as Luther Davis, who expressed disdain for bluegrass and progressive styles, when asked about Cockrum, said simply and poignantly, good fiddler. I like that quote, good fiddler. All right, we got 3 minutes here. And Cockrum also entered into fiddle competitions as early as 20 years old and placed well among his peers. So here is some fiddling from Fred Cockrum on fiddle, him playing Pretty Little Girl, recorded by Ray Alden, and the tuning of AEAE with his buddy Kyle Creed on the banjo. All right, I hope that came through for you. Just some really impressive short bow fiddling from Fred Cockrum. Now, in conclusion, even though Fred Cockrum's legacy was overshadowed by folklorist glamorization of Tommy Jarrell, Cockrum was the only one from Round Peak to emerge as a professional musician who made his living on the road. And this is very true. He did make his living bouncing around from radio station to radio station early on. And when not able to make rent or pay for groceries through music, Cockrum could be found throughout the Round Peak area making a living as a painter. His daughter, Juanita, said he had an artistic eye for mixing colors and painting. Now, Cockrum died in poverty, but he still, to this day, serves as an ambassador around the world as one of Round Peak and indeed the South's greatest old-time musicians, in my opinion. Cockrum's music also serves as a critical link in the chain of American music times past and present. So I think we're up against time here. We've got 1 minute. Let me show you my bibliography. This is my bibliography, lots of good stuff. And my discography. Check out the FRC recordings. They're really great recordings. That's the Field Recorders Collective. And so this comes from FRC 101. And then also check out Nathan Frazier if you ever get a chance. His recordings are really great. And here's a picture of Fred and Tommy. And in the background, you have Fred's wife there, kind of wondering what the heck's going on with these old hippies taking our picture. So, that is my presentation. I want to thank everyone for having me. And that's time. So now I know we're out of time. And yeah, I welcome any questions that you all have. And yeah, it's great to be here. I hope to see you all in person someday. Thank you very much for your time.
All right, folks. Thanks for sticking with us here. Let's come back. Y'all please feel free to unmute, bring your faces back into the mix here, and ask us any questions that you have.
This is Fred Bartenstein. How did you first get interested in Fred Cockerum?
I actually was from Oklahoma, and I had been touring around a lot, and I kind of knocked on the door of a banjo player, John Herman, in Asheville, North Carolina, and he said, all right, well, you can live with me for a year, and I'll teach you everything you want to know. And he introduced me to Fred Cockerum, and I was just hooked.
I had a question, John. As a fiddler myself, I was wondering, where would Howard Armstrong fit into your typology of short bow and long bow fiddlers?
Well, I have to be honest and confess that I've never heard of the man.
Okay, the Tennessee Chocolate Drops. Yeah, look him up. I'd be curious to hear what you say about him in contrast to, the Fraser Patterson sound. But Howard Armstrong,
Okay.
from that might, at least it shows there are some different approaches in the African American side of the fiddling traditions that you're looking at.
Yeah. Lee, this is Phil Jameson.
Hey, Phil.
Hey, Lee, you beat me to it. I was just about to mention Howard Armstrong as an example of an African American fiddler who played. If you listen to his 1930 recording of, I think it was Vine Street Rag, he sounds very much like in the style of Arthur Smith. And as a dancer and a dance musician, I think of the longbow fiddling that became popularized as music was less concentrated on dancing. Fiddlers are not perhaps playing for dances as much, but more in performance. And that's sort of how I view the change in the fiddling styles. But Howard Armstrong's definitely one. I can share it. I can share it with you tomorrow.
Thank you, Phil.
Great. Any other questions? Maybe we could, I really apologize for these technical difficulties. We may be more on track right now.
I see there's a question in the chat. What's the source of the Jabor lecture? I believe Phil would know better than me. I don't have it offhand. I'm sorry. I sort of just wrote it in really quick in my bibliography. I believe, Phil, could you correct me on this? I think it was Indiana University.
Yes, it was a lecture that he gave about American fiddling, and where he describes American fiddling as not a direct descendant but a cultural cousin, um, growing up at the same time as the traditions in the British Isles. I could get the reference if you'd like it.
Thanks, Phil.
Great,
Yes,
folks.
please. I would love to see or hear that lecture for myself.
Sure,
If one of you could share the specific
I have
citation,
a
that'd be great. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, folks. Yeah, if you can find it before the session's done today, you can put it in the chat and share it that way. That'd be great. Well, folks, I would love to move on. I again apologize for these delays, and I am eager to welcome our next presenter. Chloe Levine is a AB student in English and music at Harvard University and a lifelong student of vernacular music and dance. She is Associate U.S. Editor of the Harvard Political Review and has been awarded the John Harvard Scholarship and the Detour Book Prize. Chloe is also a singer-songwriter and producer whose second album, An Inch on Either Side, will be released later this year. And she begins her presentation with some very topically germane things. So let's move right now to her presentation.
Good afternoon. My name is Chloe E.W. Levine, and I'm so thrilled to be presenting today alongside these incredible panelists. I want to take a moment to thank the World of Bluegrass Conference and the IBMA Foundation for having me, and also to acknowledge the Harvard Political Review, where this paper was first published. So if you're anything like me, you turned off the TV after the presidential debate last night without a lot of hope for opening up healthy political discourse in this country again. For those of you who didn't see the debate, these are just two of the many hard to believe and hard to watch moments from last night. It was chaotic, abrasive, and the animosity seemed insurmountable. But I'm going to contend that bluegrass may provide an answer to this problem if it can assume a more active role in contemporary American culture. As the genre's audiences grow and thus begin to approximate the diversity of the national identity to which it is so intimately tied, the political and cultural fractures that shape American life appear among its listeners. Loyal bluegrass fans are often, though not always of course, older, white, Southern, and conservative. In contrast, new listeners responsible for the genre's growth tend to be younger, more diverse, and farther to the left politically. These demographic divisions also correlate with musical preference. Older listeners tend to favor traditional bluegrass, while younger listeners tend to prefer experimental styles, though of course we know that there is a lot of crossover here. Since the bluegrass scene's financial viability relies on a core group of devoted fans, there's a commercial imperative for musicians to find their listeners by picking a side. And due to the split's dual nature, that choice goes beyond musical sensibilities, corresponding to a decision between social preservationism and social activism. These musicians thus also join the fray in the conflict over who can claim ownership of and membership in American identity, always hotly contested between progressives and conservatives. Audience pressures compel them to take part in an ideological proxy war, one that could prove more fruitful than today's partisan political debates, where there has to be a winner and a loser. So this is where I'm headed, but let's back up for a moment. As I'm sure most of you know, while bluegrass has connections to American cultural heritage as a whole, it originated with a single band, Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys. This idea has been challenged by various scholars, including Ellen Formello in Another History of Bluegrass, and many others, but this is the generally accepted narrative of bluegrass's origins. Monroe was displaced from Appalachia by the Great Depression and drew influences from diverse traditional canons to pioneer a new sound. His music was governed by nostalgia for a mountain home, despite the poverty and hardship he experienced there. And bluegrass found commercial success among rural transplants to cities all over the country who related to Monroe's longing. Over time, his voice became a stand-in for the voices of that entire cohort. Though bluegrass was a product of individualistic innovation, strict guidelines rooted in Monroe's stylistic preferences regulated its development. As Jody Rockwell, an associate professor of music at Pomona College, explains in his article, What is Bluegrass Anyway? Category Formation Debate and the Framing of Musical Genre, traditional bluegrass must abide by specific parameters for rhythm, register, and instrumentation. Monroe is responsible for this inelasticity, the article details. Once it became clear his band had unwittingly founded a new genre, he pushed musicologists and musicians to accept his aesthetic predilections as bluegrass's inflexible definition. Because of Monroe, traditional bluegrass can sound like the product of a time capsule, mimicking music from almost a century ago. Of course, some self-proclaimed bluegrass musicians chafe at Monroe's restrictions. In order to establish a new genre, they argue, Monroe himself pushed boundaries. Challenging stringent rules, thus, is part of the spirit of the genre. Chris Pandolfi from the band The Infamous String Masters perhaps puts it best in Two Worlds of Bluegrass, which was originally published in No Depression, but it's also available on his personal blog. Those who strive to protect the music in some so-called traditional form fail to recognize the intensely original spirit of the music's founders. That view particularly resonated with Richard Emmett, a program director at the Blue Ridge Music Center who I interviewed earlier this year. His venue has partially shifted its focus towards these so-called progressive bluegrass acts in recent years, even as traditional bluegrass fans sometimes lambast their deviations from Monroe's vision for the genre. Mountain music is a living musical tradition, Emmett contends. By presenting these artists, it's not like we're doing something that hasn't been going on since the birth of the music. The rise of these innovators coincided with the mid-century urban folk revival populated by political progressives, to which bluegrass soon became linked. The genre had leftist ingredients, to be sure. Its themes of dispossession and class struggle played into anti-institutional narratives that were part of leftist thought at the time, and even today. It was the music of the working people, Emmett underscored in his interview. At the same time, urban audiences loved bluegrass because its connection with rural Appalachia provided an escape from daily routine. However, according to Rockwell's article, they escaped into a culture that bears the hallmarks of social conservatism. To this day, as we know, female and queer musicians still struggle to find work in the scene. But still, without progressive support, bluegrass likely would have disappeared altogether, reabsorbed by country music. These contradictions characterize the genre. Its creative sensibility is inherently forward-thinking, and yet by its nature, it gestures towards the past. Perhaps we should be less surprised by the divisions in its listening audience as a result. Many aspects of the bluegrass world undoubtedly reinforce the socially conservative world order. One of the many people to point this out is Ted Lehman in the article Stepping into the Spotlight, Women in Bluegrass, which was also published in No Depression. He points out that the scene is overwhelmingly male-dominated behind the microphone and in the jam circle. This is a truism accepted by many other writers in many other places as well. He points out that men playing tunes while wives sit on the sidelines is common at bluegrass festivals, and that lyrics often fall victim to the Madonna horror complex, either idealizing maternal figures or recounting domestic violence against adulterous women through murder ballads. In a 2019 article for The Guardian, writer Emma John even claims that the competitive culture between jam circle soloists, with, quote, each instrument trying to one-up what came before, is itself a form of machismo. The demographics of bluegrass are also extremely white. While African-American music unquestionably influenced bluegrass, industry pressures historically separated Black roots, dubbed race music, from white hillbilly music, keeping Black bluegrass performers out of the genre's primary commercial space. Musician and activist Rhiannon Giddens' efforts to correct this erasure are often cited and well documented and laudable, but even today, few other artists of color are elevated alongside her in popular discourse. The figures are pretty stark. According to the most recent available data from the Bluegrass Radio Network, more than 95% of listeners were white, and all of the more than 50 musicians on Bluegrass Today's Top 20 chart, when I checked in March, were white presenting. And some of these trends and their correlations to political realities of contemporary America are especially true for traditional bluegrass, which is most popular in the genre's Appalachian home, as Mark Freeman, the president of the traditional label Rebel Records, pointed out to me, saying, quote, you're going to find your demographics to be more in the South, pointing to states like Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, and North Carolina. The South in those states account for 42% of bluegrass listeners, according to that same polling data referenced earlier. These areas are predominantly conservative, particularly among older voters, and traditional bluegrass fans tend to be older, so they're particularly representative of that correlation. The subgenre, after all, represents a brand of nostalgia for a past American culture that can be traced to Monroe's longing for the mountains and is perpetuated by adherence to his strict rules. As social critics have often noted in the era of Make America Great Again, though, access to such nostalgia is unequal. For most members of marginalized groups, the 1940s, when Bill Monroe was first starting out, were a time of greater oppression. Admittedly, traditional artists typically avoid overt political messages. Freeman asserted, quote, folks don't want to hear about politics, they want to hear about all the traditional values that they've grown up with. But still, many on the left claim that language describing those traditional values codes for conservative ideologies. Esther Suh, writing for HuffPost, is one of those thinkers. She draws on Lynn Hopper's Derrida's Nostalgia. And this is obviously quite a leftist take, but the point stands. This kind of nostalgia for traditional values correlates with more conservative and social and civic policies, and thus they are politicized and associated with conservatism and republicanism more broadly. However, bluegrass owes much of its contemporary popularity to the young urban left. Unlike traditional bluegrass listeners, these musically progressive listeners are often scattered around the country. But because of the rise of music streaming platforms, these isolated individuals have been able to find bluegrass anywhere, even without access to the in-person jam circles, bars, and festivals that characterize the scene so strongly. Most industry experts accept that this cohort favors progressive bluegrass and its offshoots over traditional styles. And the undeniable link between mainstream roots-influenced acts like Mumford & Sons, the Avett Brothers, the connection between those acts and bluegrass has brought more young, diverse listeners into the genre's less conventional fold. Their aversion to traditional bluegrass may be explained by the correlation drawn between the subgenre and a stereotyped version of Southern conservatism in popular culture. This is explained really well by Benjamin Fineland's article, Oh Brother, What Next? Making Sense of the Folk Fad. In addition, I spoke to Gabe Lepak, a bluegrass fan and college student earlier this year, who's the only bluegrass fan among his friends. And he told me, quote, there's this outside view that it's all like backwater hick towns. So young liberals and leftists may be scared off by those connotations, leading them to seek progressive artists instead. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the band Lula Wiles. They're definitely bluegrass adjacent. I'm sure we could get into a lengthy debate about whether or not they qualify as bluegrass proper, but regardless, they'll do for now as a stand-in for progressive bluegrass and bluegrass adjacent genres. They view their music as a call to political action. They talk about Charlottesville and their opposition to white supremacy. They talk about indigenous rights. They talk about women's rights. And challenges to Monroe's regulations, like theirs, necessarily bring challenges to traditional bluegrass's social nostalgia as well, which they're a great example of. They parody the genre's frequent idealization of the past with lyrics like, quote, it's all history by now and we hold the pen anyhow, pointing out how history is constructed ex post facto. That's a lyric from their song Good Old American Values. And in an interview earlier this year, John Smith, the associate director of their label Smithsonian Folkways, explained that Lula Wiles speaks to, quote, a newer generation of listeners. These are listeners who want to hear what's happening today, he said, want to hear what's happening from different perspectives, and want forward-thinking music that speaks to current events in politically progressive terms. The stakes of this debate are very high. The bluegrass's audience's ardent passion for music snaps its divisions into sharper focus. A special report from Bluegrass Today suggests that the genre's listeners are 84% more likely than the general public to play an instrument, and that 77% claim listening to music as their favorite pastime. Daniel Boner, the director of Bluegrass, Old Time, and Country Music Studies at East Tennessee State University, emphasized how much fans care about the music they love in an email interview earlier this year. Bluegrass is serious, he said. Its listeners know its history and development like obsessive baseball fans geek out over what type of socks Babe Ruth wore. That was just such a wonderful quote, I had to find a way to include it. Their divergent opinions about the genre, then, are more than preferences. They're converted into principles. Still, most bluegrass listeners and musicians I spoke to were quick to rebut implications that the genre was political, painting jam circles as democratizing spaces for music about universal values and experiences. Artists choosing to take a blatantly political stance in bluegrass sail through uncharted waters. For Phil Boyce, an amateur musician from Virginia who I spoke to over email earlier this year, the absence of self-conscious politics is part of the cannon's draw. Quote, we declare a temporary armistice in the culture wars. I wish more Americans could do it. We know, especially after last night's debate, that such spaces are exceedingly rare. So Boyce's admiration for it is quite understandable. And Rockwell concurred with this point, noting that while folk revivalism has been imbued with political function, bluegrass, though being tied to that genre and that movement, has not come to a similar conclusion. However, given growing political polarization, neutrality may be a thing of the past. For bluegrass musicians, pleasing a split audience is a tall order. Having it both ways is near impossible. A contingent of the old guard dismisses progressive bluegrass and bluegrass-influenced rock and pop as opportunistic, while some devotees of the new subgenre reject traditional bluegrass as exclusionary. Besides, not all scholars agree on how the divided audience breaks down. Letting the disunity of listeners affect creative decisions might, as a result, appear quite risky. Still, ignoring audience pressures could prove far riskier. Unlike for jazz or classical music, bluegrass crowds are often devoid of wealthy potential benefactors, something Dudley Connell from the Southern Scene pointed out in the Washington Post article from 2016. And without financial support, artists who annoy too many listeners in a genre sometimes off-putting to outsiders skid on quite thin ice. The general consensus maps musical conservatism and progressivism to their socio-political counterparts. And notwithstanding some disagreement, it may be worth it for musicians to gamble on using that paradigm to court a targeted subset of listeners. Especially on the left, some modern acts have taken up the challenge. Rockwell highlighted the last 2 decades as a period of increasing political activism in bluegrass. String band Che Appalache, for example, blends Latin and bluegrass music to craft topical songs like The Wall, which argues against President Trump's border wall. On their most recent album, the bluegrass adjacent Avett Brothers, who I mentioned earlier, sang about gun violence, racism, misogyny, and more. These new activist voices are a product of, and encourage further expansion of, the genre's inclusion of artists with diverse perspectives. The preservationist traditional scene lacks that same potential for growth to negative commercial effect. As Richard Emmett explained, quote, venues that focus on strictly traditional music and aren't able or willing to think a little farther outside the box than that have maybe seen some audiences dwindle. He linked larger crowds for paid concerts at the Blue Ridge Music Center over the past few years to more progressive headliners. Mark Freeman from Rebel Records was even blunter, saying a lot of the folks who are into traditional bluegrass are older, and those folks are slowly dying off. While navigating these tensions, bluegrass musicians must understand that they cannot please everyone. Despite Emmett's box office success, he noted that activist acts face criticism from traditional fans. Thomas Cassell, the mandolinist for the progressive band Circus No. 9, knows that criticism well, and told me in an interview earlier this year, "It's weird in this music, people are much more likely to tell you what they don't like than what they do." But he spoke to me about his band's song Cool It Son, which is about climate change. It's a lovely track. I would highly recommend everyone listen to it. It's become one of my favorites. And in fact, it's a frequent favorite on bluegrass radio, Cassell explained. "We get the backlash," he said, "but those aren't the people who are supporting us anyway." This just goes to show how closely these bands and individual artists are thinking about how to tailor their music to a political listening audience. So we then face the problem. How can bluegrass spaces, communities, and industries remain sites of coexistence, as Phil Boyce and so many of us love, when musicians face these pressures? There are no easy answers to questions about the identity of bluegrass because there are no easy answers related to questions about national identity. Who should be the caretaker for a profoundly American cultural form? Traditionalists who look to its history for guidance, or progressives who see more promise in an unknown future? Many in bluegrass hope to avoid the choice altogether, prizing peaceful coexistence within jam circles without question. In fact, when musician Chris Pandolfi, who I mentioned earlier, used his 2011 keynote address at the Genres Business Conference, this in fact very conference, to explain, "We need to agree to disagree," he said, the crowd erupted into applause. But under the weight of polarization, the coalition is simply cracking. Still, unlike in electoral politics, there need not be a loser if bluegrass splinters. To quote Cassell again, he talks about the big tent representing progressive bluegrass and the small tent representing traditional bluegrass. And he says, because it's a small tent, people think it, that's again traditional bluegrass, is dying. But it's not, you know, and the big tent is bigger than it's ever been. In other words, though musicians cannot garner universal approval, there are enough listeners to go around. The metonymic discourse within bluegrass, then, has greater potential to be constructive than battles for American identity which play out in strictly political spheres. After all, in strictly political spheres, there's a clear winner, there's a clear loser. Without an imperative to defeat their opponents, impassioned bluegrass listeners can meet on the common ground of shared love for the genre. No doubt a familiar quote to some, I think Bill Monroe perhaps put it best. Bluegrass has brought more people together and made more friends than any music in the world. Perhaps bluegrass's fissures can eventually be a source of unity. Thanks very much, and I look forward to your questions.
All right, thanks, Chloe. That was excellent. So let's get set up here. Do folks have, I didn't see any in the chat. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but are there any questions for Chloe? Jocelyn, please.
So interesting and great paper. I was wondering if you'd like to comment about any perhaps comparative situations with other musicians or other genres, subgenres, and styles that might have these multiplicities of identities. And I'll just toss out the one that comes to mind for me outside of bluegrass is Willie Nelson, and the famous situations in the 70s when he's saying, and these were his words, you know, there's room for both of these crowds that are coming to see me, and one was sort of the redneck crowd and one was kind of the hippie crowd. But are there any other musics that mix and match the way that you're describing?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think I'm sure there are. I think I would have to think a little bit more closely. I mean, a lot of other vernacular forms come to mind. Sacred harp, for one. Its Northeast contingent being quite distinct from a Southern contingent until you get to national conventions. So that's just one that sprung to mind immediately. I do think that those realms of coexistence are becoming more rare, based on my research, in line with the broader political polarization that's going on, and affecting the way that we consume all culture in quite politicized ways. But yeah, I'm sure that there are multiplicitous examples, especially when you go back to earlier in the 20th century.
Yeah, the idea of Willie Nelson, Chloe, bouncing off Jocelyn's idea, if I can, makes me think of Dolly Parton. I listened through the recent Dolly Parton's America, and those discussions about Dolly as a just really unusual unifying figure are interesting. Have you thought some about her, or are there any solutions we can take from her status and what she does?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I will confess that while I know, I think, a fair amount about Dolly Parton compared to the average American, I haven't done much scholarly research into her. I think that she also has the benefit of time, that her career began long enough ago that there was still access to a broader consensus, and that her legacy can live on into the present day as a result of that in some ways. And I'm sure she also, benefits from her ties to bluegrass, even as she diverges into many different genres, because bluegrass has had that duality historically. But yeah, I'll bear that in mind in terms of future research for sure.
Right, and any other questions? I've got all kinds of questions if nobody else steps up. Yes, sir, Ira.
Yeah, I was, can you hear me? Okay. I was thinking, as far as another style of music that maybe has analogous issues, not so much political, but as different branches of its audience, is blues. Because I think, like bluegrass, blues, and unlike most other kinds of music, it maintains as part of its mythology the idea of being tied to a particular regional and socioeconomic group. And yeah, I'm not prepared to elaborate on that right now, but I'm wondering if anybody else here has some thoughts on that.
Yeah, if anyone wants to chime in, I mean, I don't, I don't know that I have anything more to add on that particular topic at the moment. But
and also, progressive versus traditional arguments are all throughout the blues world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of named systems revivals where there would be a lot of parallels or interesting contrasts for sure.
Yeah, Lee, could I throw in something there? The name system revivals is definitely something that I think of, and there's like one dynamic aesthetically between the traditionalists and the progressives, but then you also have the dynamic between the tradition bearers and the revivalists. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think there's often a disconnect in terms of political views between those two groups. I know that was true in old time music back in the day, and it's true in Cajun music, which I know more about.
Yeah, I think one thing that I've found in preparing for this paper is that there's not a whole lot of quantitative research into this. So that's something that I would love to either pursue or read about somebody else pursuing in the future to get a little bit of a better handle on how those demographics play out exactly.
I might just chime in quickly. Thanks for your paper. But one thing I was thinking about as you were speaking was, I think it was last week that Tyler Childers came out with a long violent history and a message that was really addressed, the political nature of that recording. And it definitely skews kind of as an old time record, but as a younger artist, it reminded me of that example of the political divide in his fan base.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Jody, please.
Quick question. Thanks so much, Chloe. I'm really intrigued by this idea of bluegrass adjacent, which you used a few times, and I'm wondering if that's kind of your term, or if you were also speaking with musicians, if they're bluegrass artists out there saying, well, yeah, I play music and it's kind of next to bluegrass.
I think in terms of that specific terminology, it's my own, but I certainly have heard people talk about themselves as being, as you say, next to bluegrass, or on the cusp of bluegrass, or influenced by bluegrass, and it comes down to those gnarly debates that I referenced several times from your article of how exactly the category of bluegrass is defined, and I think. There's going back to the beginning of the decade that's just passed, there's been quite a bit of discourse about whether or not those categorizations are too restrictive. And I think my sense is that a fair number of people just want to avoid those conversations altogether at this point and really just focus on the music. Also, good to see you in person.
Just to address Ira, the name systems term is one that I take from the 1993 volume, Transforming Tradition. That's one that I saw used there. So, well, if we could, one or two more comments or questions for Chloe. I did have one. Chloe, I wonder if you'd seen Justin Acombe's work. He's a political scientist who wrote about bluegrass. And I think one of the things that he writes about that's concerning, but I think he opens up possibilities and looks for possibilities as you are. The problem he sees is depoliticization, and he draws from Rancière, and I think he goes really deep on this idea. I still haven't gotten to my head fully around it, but I think in that terms it's not neutrality, but it's an active displacement of politics. In a way that doesn't seem productive in his view.
Yeah, I've not read that. I would be really interested too if you wouldn't mind dropping the citation in the chat. But yeah, I appreciate that distinction a lot. And I think it's quite in line with what a number of people said in interviews with me, particularly now that it's kind of a respite from the outside world. And I guess in terms of whether or not that's productive, you have to wonder whether we're talking about productivity in terms of musical production and community building, or productivity in terms of some sort of political movement or progression towards bipartisanship. So different modes for sure. But thank you all so much for your questions and comments. Great to talk to you today.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Chloe. We are moving rapidly on to our next presenter, who is Hunter Dukes. He is a graduate student in the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology at Indiana University in Bloomington. All right, I like it. And his research focuses on the bluegrass scene in the upper Midwest and the Great Northern Bluegrass Festival at Mole Lake in Wisconsin. And he's also beginning some research into banjo performance in Costa Rican calypso music. So please make him welcome as I get his presentation.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the New Research in Bluegrass panel at the World of Bluegrass Symposium. I would like to thank the IBMA Foundation for their sponsorship of this event. I would also like to thank Lee Bidgood for putting this all together. and for helping me to learn from and share my research with such wonderful scholars. My name is Hunter Dukes, and I am a graduate student at Indiana University in Bloomington. Today, we will explore the history of the bluegrass scene in Wisconsin's Northwoods and use these insights to reimagine bluegrass's past, present, and future. I grew up going to bluegrass festivals and playing the banjo in northern Wisconsin with my family. I refer to this vernacular region, which includes parts of Minnesota and Michigan's Upper Peninsula, as the Northwoods, following the work of folklorist Jim Leary. The paper that follows draws from over a decade of lived experience in the Northwoods bluegrass scene and from research on materials at the Archives of Traditional Music at Indiana University. I argue that close reading of the Northwoods scene and its contrasts with institutionalized genre discourse opens new perspectives on bluegrass. Sue Toohey writes that genre conceptions directly structure events, and musical events themselves go on to reinforce these conceptions. This paper traces the involvement of the folk revival in the early development of bluegrass, showing how conceptions of the genre as traditional Southern culture influenced the first festivals and discourse on bluegrass still today. A relatively small group of people, including Ralph Rinsler, Mike Seeger, Maine Smith, and Neil Rosenberg, worked to shape public opinion regarding bluegrass. Rosenberg's edited volume, Transforming Tradition, goes into detail on this process of traditionalizing bluegrass and establishing it in the US music industry. That is to say, Bill Monroe did not invent bluegrass music. Folklorists and marketing agents did. Of course, we'll see that many of these figures served a dual role as folklorist and marketing agent. Monroe himself was hesitant to label competing acts like the Stanley Brothers as bluegrass because he saw them as merely imitating his unique style. By re-examining the history of bluegrass festivals, we can find in the Northwoods alternatively structured events and distinct conceptions of the genre. The new generation of bluegrass fans in the Northwoods selectively adopted and adapted mainstream ideas of what bluegrass music and bluegrass festivals can be. Recent research by Jordan Laney shows how conceptions of bluegrass stem from the stories we tell about it, and she calls for us to rehistoricize the genre. I'm not trying to slander or defame these early bluegrass scholars. They did important and useful research that's really inspired me. But that work had the side effect of perpetuating an ideology of bluegrass purely as Southern traditional culture, which feels exclusionary gatekeeping and fixes our perspective on the past rather than on contemporary lived experiences of bluegrass. While many great books are written about the early recording history and the performance careers of bluegrass icons, far fewer books ethnographically explore current living bluegrass communities. For the first several decades after the Monroe brothers' earliest recordings, bluegrass was primarily experienced in a mediated format through records or radio, and live performances were largely local events held at country music parks. It was the folk revival of the 1950s and 60s which gave rise to the first bluegrass festivals. Ralph Rinsler, a folklorist mandolin player living in New York's Greenwich Village, had cut his teeth with Mike Seeger, making field recordings in Appalachia. Seeger and Rinsler acted as agents for the musicians they recorded, earning them fame and a reputation as bearers of America's folk traditions. Rinsler's strategy to promote his clients like Doc Watson and Clarence Ashley, was to attract educated urban audiences by demonstrating, quote, the folkness of their roots through historical and biographical details. Bill Monroe especially offered a compelling story of musical tradition, and Rinsler took over as his manager in 1963. He also advised Monroe's former manager, Carlton Haney, when Haney organized the first multi-day bluegrass music festival. The Roanoke Bluegrass Festival at Fincastle, Virginia was held on Memorial Day weekend in 1965. It would forever connect bluegrass to the medium of the festival. Haney incorporated instrumental workshops like the ones Rinsler had helped establish at the Newport Folk Festival, as well as his own Story of Bluegrass music program, where they literally reenacted a romanticized history of bluegrass to musical accompaniment. It centered the music of Bill Monroe, and it featured a lineup of former bluegrass boys at Roanoke. It was apparent that Haney was following Rinsler's strategy of tapping into the enthusiasm of the folk revival movement by appealing to urban educated audiences. Surviving posters from the Second Roanoke Festival, housed at the Archives of Traditional Music, only lists one ticket vendor all the way in New York City, hundreds of miles from the festival location. And stylistically, too, in the early 1960s, folk revival bands from New England, such as the New Lost City Ramblers, the Country Gentlemen, and the Greenbrier Boys, conformed more closely to Bill Monroe's stylistic formula than a lot of Southern bluegrass acts like Earl Scruggs and Benny Martin, who by that time were beginning to electrify in the wake of rock and roll. So bluegrass was starting to take on new shapes and manifestations in the early 60s. And by the 70s, bluegrass festivals had spread across the country and beyond. Some of the work of George Carney from the 70s shows the distribution of festivals by then. In fact, there was an established bluegrass band called Bluegrass 45 based out of Japan before any had emerged in the state of Wisconsin. But the first bluegrass band out of Wisconsin was the Piper Road Spring Band. They originally formed as a rock group, but switched to a bluegrass format after hearing the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band's 1972 album, Will the Circle Be Unbroken? By the winter of 1973, they performed for the president of Schlitz Brewing Company, sharing a bill with none other than Bill himself, Bill Monroe. At the show up in Wisconsin, Bill Monroe invited them down to his festival in Bean Blossom, Indiana, where they forged friendships with some of the most famous performers in bluegrass. And it was through these networks that Piper Road Spring Band was able to help convince many of these top acts to attend a new festival that had been formed called the Great Northern Bluegrass Festival. So the Great Northern Bluegrass Festival was located on the Secaucus Chippewa Reservation near Mole Lake, Wisconsin, and it began in 1976. It was the first multi-day festival in the state of Wisconsin. The Mole Lake, as it was called by those who experienced it, attracted tens of thousands of fans and the biggest stars in bluegrass. The impact of Mole Lake on bluegrass in Wisconsin cannot be understated. Musicians, festival organizers, and fans in the Northwoods are inspired by their sometimes indirect experiences with Mole Lake, and its presence is still strongly felt at festivals today. The key players in the organization of Mole Lake were Wisconsinites, who did not have the same moral and academic investment in the traditions of bluegrass as folk revivalists. John Ulrich, one of the original promoters of the festival, was a musician from Wausau, Wisconsin. And later on, full control over Mole Lake was handed to the Secaucus Chippewa in 1978. Because of its location on a reservation, local police had no jurisdiction. And many people who went there told me stories that the only rule was no glass bottles. From its first year, Mole Lake featured the world's most famous bluegrass acts, including Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys, Earl Scruggs and the Stanley Brothers, alongside emerging new grass acts like John Hartford and the New Grass Revival. Interspersed with these bluegrass or bluegrass adjacent acts were bands that were even further from the genre, like the Canadian folk rock ensemble, The Band, or the Southern rock Ozark Mountain Daredevils, or even the Cajun fiddler, Doug Kershaw. The program at Mole Lake not distinguish between different styles or genres of the bands, so attendees tended to appreciate any energetic or engaging performance. For a lot of fans, music was actually a secondary role. It served a secondary role to the real party happening across the vast grounds of Mole Lake, especially in the mud pit demolition derby. Here's a photo of burnt cars from the 1991 Mole Lake Festival. Many Mole Lake stories involve burning cars or burning couches or burning giant stacks of pallets and then driving through them in a bus. Other stories involved unlicensed sales of liquor and fireworks or skinny dipping in Mole Lake. Taken together, these stories have created a mythos of Mole Lake, which has outlived the original festival and still shapes current Northwoods bluegrass. The Great Northern Bluegrass Festival would run officially for 16 years until the Secaucus Chippewa tribe decided to end it. Attendees tore down the stage and outhouses and everything for the unofficial 17th festival in 1992 called The One That Had to Happen, where many people literally came away with a piece of Mole Lake. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So toward Mole Lake's ends, and more small festivals started popping up around the Northwoods. Fans sought to extend their experiences at Mole Lake and meet their friends again to listen to bluegrass. A community formed through these festivals, a core group of diehard fans who all know each other and attend every festival they can. Some of my friends call this the bluegrass family, though the Northwood scene is constantly shifting as new bands and listeners and events emerge. There are now over a dozen different festivals in the Northwoods, mostly attended and organized by this core group. You can see on this kind of blurry map that I put up, there's each of those red dots represents a festival. There's certainly other events that I could have included here. And the one green dot up in the northeast a little bit is Mole Lake, of course. In the middle of the screen, there's a photo of me playing the banjo with one of an old band of mine called Ramblin' Roots, and we were playing at kind of a private party hosted by a local bluegrass fan, and every year he holds sort of a birthday party for himself. This time it was a fake wake themed, which is fun. And this structure that we're playing under, the plaque that you see on it, commemorates the shelter as the original women's outhouse shelter from Mole Lake. It was at that 1992 festival, the one that had to happen, where this bluegrass fan took the actual women's outhouse shelter and now gets bands to play in it annually. And I got that opportunity as well several years ago. So it's a really fun experience. And on the far left of the screen, you can see a little more subtle of a way, you know, here's a fan decorating her hotel room door. This is the only indoor bluegrass festival in the Northwoods, but the at this festival, Swamp and Grass, bluegrassers will rent out whole floors of these hotel rooms and treat their hotel rooms like a campsite. And you can see here that she put this photo of herself from Mole Lake in 1984, over 30 years ago, commemorating, you know, these memories and allowing that experience of Mole Lake, those memories to help shape her current experience, you know, with those same friends that she went to Mole Lake with originally. So we can see how Mole Lake is still influencing bluegrass today in the Northwoods. Most contemporary bluegrass festivals in the Northwoods differ significantly from Rinsler and Haney's original folk festival models. For instance, instrument workshops, designed with the self-conscious goal of cultural preservation, are almost entirely absent from Northwoods festivals. Bluegrass in the Pines, one of the only festivals to include these workshops, instrumental workshops, is organized by the band Art Stevenson and Highwater, who adhere more closely to conventional bluegrass Monroe style playing. In this case, we can observe a connection between generic orthodoxy in musical performance style and in festival organization. Neil Rosenberg wrote of Southern bluegrass festivals. They advertise that they prohibit dogs, drugs, motorcycles, loud portable stereos, and electric instruments, unquote. You can find all of those things at Northwoods festivals pretty often. And it's nearly impossible to find any dry bluegrass shows in the state of Wisconsin. Certainly, festivals like Roanoke and Bean Blossom were no strangers to substance use and rowdiness, but Mole Lake was known because of its party atmosphere. For the most part, current bluegrassers look to recreate that experience, albeit to a lesser degree. Most Northwoods festivals today are locally or privately organized. There are basically no corporate sponsors. Festival organizers often camp in the same grounds and sit around the same campfires as everybody else. Likewise, local Northwoods bands play at every festival alongside national touring acts. The styles of Northwoods bands range from groups like Art Stevenson, and Highwater, Art Stevenson and Highwater, who play very close to Monroe's traditional model, to Horseshoes and Hand Grenades, who infuse old time and jam band elements to their music, to Dig Deep, whose sound and aesthetic borrows heavily from outlaw country and heavy metal. These three bands only begin to illustrate the musical diversity of the Northwoods bluegrass scene, but time constraints limit the amount of groups I can discuss. Take it from me that there's a lot of variation in the style that people play. Few bands would call themselves traditional bluegrass. Some might choose to lump all these genre-bending acts into Americana or country or please some other genre than bluegrass. But the festivals in the Northwoods unabashedly label themselves bluegrass despite these gatekeeping debates. Festival organizers in the Northwoods, whose experiences of bluegrass were mostly formed at Mole Lake, are more likely to book genre-bending bands due to Mole Lake's eclectic lineup. Also, since most of these festivals are small and not lavishly funded, organizers cannot afford to gatekeep local bands from their events. So, bluegrass festivals structure our experience of music and community. This paper has shown historical processes of music change and the formation of a regional scene which has gone mostly under the radar of bluegrass research. Mole Lake inspired a generation of bands and musicians in the Northwoods, laying the foundation for a new community and a thriving local scene. This shows how genre constructions structure events and how events go on to structure genre conceptions. It's by uncovering the Northwood scene's local history and its internal dynamics, we can see how people adapt the bluegrass to new contexts. I hope more research can cover regional scenes and genre-bending bands and festivals that are different from what we might expect in order to expand our understanding of bluegrass. Thank you all very much.
All right. Thanks so much to Hunter. That was fantastic. Thank you for bringing out, hey, lovely claps, y'all. Y'all are so good at Zoom. Wonderful. So let's get you set up here. So folks, I don't think I saw any questions in the chat here, but if y'all have them, come on back and let's give them to Hunter. Any questions to start out?
Well, I'll just really quick say I apologize. There's a bunch of typos in that whole presentation, so sorry for making you guys deal with that. But I see one thing in here from the chat about James Atkinson says that should account for the topic of the concept of critical infrastructure. I don't know if you'd be able to explain a little bit more about that. I do not have much of an idea of what you're talking about there.
James, if you
hang on here. Critical infrastructure is a concept I ran into sometime here in the last few years that you have, unlike say 50, 60 years ago, you have a wide variety of stakeholders, people interested. Critics could be academics in books, journals. You have all of the social media kinds of things that are out there, be Twitter, Facebook. You've got the Boot and all of those other kinds of publications, all of which talk about, at some point, authenticity and the nature of the beast, and I think that plays into how ideas get batted around in any of the roots music, and maybe beyond that, but particularly in roots music. So that's kind of what hit me.
Yeah, that's actually, yeah, really helpful for me to think about, and I guess like kind of throughout the course of this project, I've really tried to, consider how the different, these different stakeholders, like you were saying, how do festivals, how do scenes look different when you have local people, not Southerners who maybe don't have the same ideas about bluegrass as a tradition as, say, folk revivalists did. So yeah, that's the critical infrastructure is really helpful.
One question, Anna, did you have your hand up? I just saw your hand up here in the chat. Is that a question that's been brewing?
No, I was trying to clap. I'm not very good
Okay.
at Zoom.
That was the one-handed clap. That was great. Any other questions, folks, about this presentation? Please, Jocelyn.
I have to comment that I really enjoyed the material culture bit of the photo on the hotel door from all those years before. I had a question, if you could talk a little bit more about how the bands, particularly the local and regional bands that maybe by sound we wouldn't instantly call bluegrass, when they advertise to their fans, hey, we're playing this festival, do they say, hey, we're playing a bluegrass festival? What language do they use, and how do they intersect with the word bluegrass? If it's not something that matches what we might intuitively call their style.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. A lot of these bands, yeah, because each band has kind of their own relationship to bluegrass, right? But they're all playing under the same local festivals that are kind of labeled as bluegrass. And the fans, the fan base, I guess I can't say too much about how these bands themselves I guess I'll say a little bit more about how they market themselves, but the fan base that they're mainly reaching out to at these festivals are a lot of the same people who've been going to them since Mole Lake, right? And those fans generally tend to not to kind of label any band as bluegrass kind of more generally, that appears at these festivals. So most of the fans in the Northwoods don't kind of get those don't have the genre debates in exactly the same way. But there are certain bands like Sloppy Joe, for instance, who they really fun kind of hippie-ish, John Hartford heavily influenced them. Michael Hurley they're friends with Michael Hurley, but they don't call themselves bluegrass, they call themselves slopgrass, Sloppy Joe, slopgrass. It's anyway, that's another band that you can see they're very explicitly toying with this idea of bluegrass.
Absolutely. I just wanted to point out one thing, if I could, because I'm the moderator. I think there's an interesting parallel here to what Chloe was talking about with the idea that who determines the nature of the genre and sort of the identity. And I thought it was really interesting. You point out very concretely that at least you're hypothesizing that the power of the progressive element is such that they retain their grasp and their hold onto bluegrass, even though some in the South, I think it might be different, right? There are various promoters who really control in different ways the musical ingredients and the stylistic things and so on.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And I don't know if Chloe, if you have anything specific to add onto that, but I don't know. Yeah, I really did enjoy your presentation there, and certainly felt a lot of that. But yeah, and not to say that it's just this traditional versus progressive dichotomy. I guess we've seen through our presentations that there's many shades.
And I'm apologize. I think we probably should move on. I'm sorry to shuffle us, especially with me asking that last question. But I don't want. I know we're going to go a little over this thing. Emily, is that going to be all right for you? I didn't ask you earlier. Okay, sorry. Let's move on, and we are going to now hear from Emily Williams Roberts, who is a PhD student in ethnomusicology, and her current research interests include disability and deaf studies, applied ethnomusicology, participatory music, perception, and American fiddle musics. Her MA thesis analyzed the dynamics of accommodation for disability within bluegrass and old-time jam sessions. She's presented at the SEM annual meeting and will do so again in the future. As a musician, she performed extensively as a classical violinist and fiddler at places like Carnegie Hall, the Opry, Bluegrass Underground, and the Country Music Hall of Fame. And she's enjoyed broadening her perspectives through performing with the Sot Al Wadi Middle East Ensemble and the UT Balinese Gamelan Ensemble. So join me in welcoming Emily Roberts, and I will get her video up right now.
Somewhere between playing Tennessee 1949 and Blue Ridge Cabin Home, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to look at the old man who had been listening to our jam from the side of the wood-paneled room. "Do you play Kentucky Waltz?" he asked me. I nodded. He smiled. He waved his hand toward the men leading the jam to get their attention. "She's going to play Kentucky Waltz for me." The circle of older men turned to me, accepting the request gladly. I was the only fiddle player at the jam that night, and they liked the way I played. In addition, this jam, located in Kingston, Tennessee, in an old schoolhouse turned community center, wasn't known for attracting younger musicians. Young folks, like myself, who knew the style and etiquette, were thus seen as a treasure, something to be cherished, nurtured, and featured. "What key do you play that in?" the man leading the jam asked me. I thought for a second, having not played the tune since I competed with it several months ago at Fest. "I believe I play it in D." "B? No, D." "G? D as in dog." He strummed the chord and nodded. "What'd she say? G?" a man across the circle called out. The lead guitar player answered by calling out, "D dog," and strumming the chord. The other musicians followed suit, adjusting their instruments for the upcoming song. The banjo player made eye contact with me and, over the sound of capos moving and strings being retuned, stated, "You probably don't know it, but most of us are just about deaf here." I laughed. "Don't worry, I am too." I thought about the interaction as I played the Bell Monroe tune. These informal bluegrass jam sessions are a type of participatory music, defined by Thomas Torino as a special type of artistic practice in which there are no artist-audience distinctions, only participants and potential participants performing different roles. And the primary goal is to involve the maximum number of people in some performance role. I attended jam sessions in Texas during middle and high school before re-engaging with jams in East Tennessee for my thesis research. As a hearing impaired musician myself, disability has always been a factor in the jams I've attended. My time attending the jam sessions brought me in contact with many musicians experiencing the physical effects of aging. As being able is an inherently temporary self-designation, aging is an inevitable cause of disability. As such, the majority of older adults, both in the jam circle and elsewhere, could be considered to have some form of disability. While these impairments could be labeled mild or severe and may affect a variety of functions, the aging process impacts how the formerly able body interacts with the world. However, many of the musicians I interacted with do not self-identify as having disabilities, despite their active acknowledgement of their impairments. I discovered that the word disability was used in a very medicalized, demeaning manner. However, my observations of the actions of these musicians show that their method of accommodating the physical needs of themselves and their fellow participants did not fall into the same pattern of medicalization. By examining the practices of these jam sessions and the identity categories at play, I argue that aging bluegrass musicians create a participatory form of accommodation through their desire to make space for their own changing bodies and identities. When I began my research on disability and jam sessions, I planned to find musicians who fit into the category most would consider disabled, specifically those who were born with disabilities or acquired them from an accident or illness. In other words, I had not intended to research aging as a form of disability. While I did find musicians that fit these specifications and learned much from them, I also came to recognize that part of what created the model of accommodation I had long observed in the jam was the diversity of both strengths and limitations. I could not understand the experience of traditionally defined disabled experiences without understanding age and age-related disabilities, nor could I understand the jam session itself. In light of this, I brought up the idea of disability with many of the older musicians I came in contact with. I found they were quick to pass off the identity category of disability to others, often the same category I had originally assumed I would study. The term, to them, seemed to apply to those of working age. These individuals were often unemployed and potentially received supplemental security income, more commonly referred to as disability benefits. It's common for these musicians to know someone they consider disabled. I have heard quite a few stories that began with, "I know a banjo player who," or "I used to jam with this guitar player that." Even as a musician telling me the story adjusted the volume on their own hearing aid. Most of the musicians viewed their own impairments, mobility challenges, hearing loss, and vision loss as merely part of growing old. More theoretically, these musicians define disability through the medical model, which considers disability an ultimate state that occurs at a culturally defined point of dysfunction. Rosemary Garland Thompson defines this as the clinically disabled category, in which an individual is excluded from economic opportunities and therefore is without free agency, self-determinism, and self-possession. In other words, the medical view of disability refers to a binary, something one either is or is not. Disability equates to dysfunctionality, thereby creating a category the individual desires to reject. By rejecting disability and blaming the aging process instead, the musicians create a loophole in their own binary, a space where they can accept their limitations without the stigma of disability. This is not a rejection of personal limitations, but a linguistic evasion of dependency and loss of agency. According to Iris Young, dependency in our society thus implies, as it has in all liberal societies, a sufficient warrant to suspend basic rights to privacy, respect, and individual choice. Accepting disability for this group indicates losing one's freedom and independence, such as living in one's own home. By minimizing one's impairments through both linguistic means and physical actions, the aging individual can attempt to maintain their image, and with that, their right to autonomy. While the aging individual desires to maintain their autonomy, the desire to pass off the term disability and its connection to dependency goes beyond the preservation of one's self-image. To lose one's independence is to be closer to death. The association of loss of functionality, agency, disability, and mortality displays what Iris Young terms as the border anxiety of the abject, elaborating on Julia Kristeva by stating that, in confronting old or disabled people, I confront my own death. In other words, by formally acknowledging their body's impairments without naming them disabilities, the musicians in these jam sessions allow themselves to temporarily deny their mortality. It allows them to claim youth through their acknowledgement of the opposite. And so we arrive back to the jam circle, amid an inner conflict that realizes that the lived experience of disability does not line up with what has been, perhaps, a lifelong definition built on ableism. This inner conflict is set within the participatory nature of the jam. To quote my longtime jam friend, Gail, "The great thing about bluegrass is they don't discriminate against folks who want to jam. If you've got an instrument and you walk up to a jam somewhere, you fit in right away. This is what makes it great." The idea of role, jam etiquette, and instrumental responsibility has already been discussed by scholars including Michelle Kislewick and Liza Sapir-Flood. Instead, I look to the formation of the jam session to understand the accommodation that occurs. Further, I acknowledge that the shift in defining the self is a critical element that makes the jam welcoming. At its core, the jam session is an activity that is created by the interaction of individuals. While there may be a set ideal according to performative standards, a jam takes the shape of who is in attendance, as well as their characteristics. If all participants know how to jam, as discussed by Kislewick, then each musician understands how they can contribute to the overarching musical object, be that through melody, harmony, ornamentation, rhythmic accompaniment, or some combination of these elements. The specific people who attend a jam bring unique abilities and limitations, both musically and physically. The jam, then, does not exist until the individuals gather, indicating that the addition or subtraction of one individual can change both the social and musical tone of the jam. Thus, the jam is not an event in itself, but a gathering of differing abilities. Within the context of the jam session, the musicians must locate their social behaviors within the interactions between individuals, echoing the musicking itself. Just as claiming one musician or musical line as subordinate to another would disturb the participatory nature of the musicking, claiming one body as subordinate to another would disturb the social elements of the jam. As such, accommodation itself breaks away from the top-down economical models commonly used in our society, in which a power figure provides a service to a subordinate. Rather, accommodation becomes participatory, distributing the responsibility of inclusion to all in the circle. Accommodation becomes focused on specific wants and needs with a great deal of individualism. This occurs not because there is an economic benefit to be had, but out of an understanding of limitation. What I need, based on my specific body, may not be the same as the guitar player sitting next to me. I, as one participant, cannot take my strengths for granted, nor can I hold my abilities over the abilities of another. Instead, each participant must see each other as individuals. This individualistic perspective calls into question the very idea of deficiency, as the person exists outside of comparison to others. Further, while the musician may see their body as deficient compared to their past self, it is the present self who makes music. Perhaps just as importantly, the dynamic of the session and the goal of pleasurable participation indicates that determining want versus need has become trivial. Can one claim that inclusion in a conversation is a want? Is the verbal banter of calling out keys based on a need? To participate is to enjoy. In this sense, all wants that impact the enjoyment of the jam are also the needs that impact if someone may participate. From this lens, the choice to speak louder, repeat information, move chairs, or use both visual and oral cues seem just as built into the fabric of the jam session as the music itself. In a broader sense, this idea of accommodating for pleasure is radical. It directly challenges the concept of making up for deficiency. The simple idea that the individual with a disability has an equal right to enjoyment and not just participation is disappointingly unusual. According to Simi Linton, society's choice, and I see it as a choice, to exclude disabled people from social and cultural events that afford pleasure are indications of the belief that pleasure is less consequential to disabled people than to non-disabled people. How dare we crippled, blind, and crazy folks ask for parity? Shouldn't we be satisfied with the provision of medical care and sustenance and leave the luxuries for those who are thought to drain fewer resources from society? The idea that we, both the disability community and the aging musicians in these jams, could engage with music solely for our enjoyment and not for therapeutic reasons or to express our ability to overcome our disability demonstrates this belief. The inclusion of the disabled body within the enjoyment of the jam session confronts the notion of passive existence and claims that all, including disabled individuals, have the right to thrive. The jam session, then, is a radical space. The man sitting to my right leaned over to me, his physical action catching my attention so I could hear what he was about to say. "Grab the high tenor line for the chorus," he told me as we were about to wrap up the verse. "I can't sing that high anymore." I hesitated. "I don't know the song or the lyrics," I replied. While I was happy to take the high tenor line when I knew the song, I had never heard this tune before. It was too late. My words were lost in the sound, and he was expecting my harmony vocals. I took a breath and found the starting pitch for the tenor line. The melody was standard enough, making the harmony easy to find. The words did not matter, I realized, as I mostly sung vowels and the occasional words I remembered from the first time we had played through the chorus. What mattered was that something was missing, and my presence that evening, both as the only fiddler in the circle and the only vocalist who could hit the high tenor line, was the solution. My evening at the Jam in Kingston placed me in a space in which my abilities and limitations were both clearly seen. If I had not been there, the same songs would have been sung, the same way they were all the times before I walked in with my fiddle, audio recorder, and consent forms, and as they will be played many times going forward. In the sessions, the songs are complete as they are, regardless of performative definitions. However, at that jam, in that moment, my musical line provided an element we felt would benefit our music. In other words, the song was whole without my addition, but we knew, based on the standards of performative bluegrass, that the song would be fuller and more satisfying with the additional part. The sounded realization of our ideal music was created by our participation, presence, and careful listening to the needs of the music we were creating together. In the same way, our social behavior reflected the music. While linguistically, the musicians I spent time jamming with may have denied the identity of disability, the awareness of need shaped the jam session. We listened for needs and wants and responded in turn. We paid attention to where limitations were shown and stepped in to fill in the gaps. We repeated information until everyone was on the same page, moved chairs around so everyone could see, and used both visual and oral cues. In doing so, my hearing impairment was accommodated for without question. I was not deficient. Rather, I was in need of an accommodation to help me reach my fullest potential. The Jam was a participatory social event that directly reflected the music we created. In other words, my use of the term participatory to refer to this model of accommodation is not incidental. This is participatory accommodation, a powerful model of listening, responding, and interaction. This model accepts diverse voices as a natural part of the musical texture, as well as the social experience. Accommodations exist not to make all bodies measure up to the same standard. Instead, each participant has an equal opportunity to contribute to the whole through their unique set of skills and sounds, regardless of disability status. Reflecting on the jam session forces us to reconsider our idea of an accommodating environment. While, of course, the jam is not a perfect space, there are lessons ingrained in the practices of the space that we would be amiss not to cherish and learn from. While most of the musicians I have played music with likely would never call attention to this unique social dynamic, many of them recognize that it exists. However, within the jam session, this concept is not something unique or unusual. It is being in relationship with one another, being kind, and loving your neighbor. It is metaphorically picking up the high tenor line, the fiddle break, or holding the rhythm steady in the music of our social lives. To quote many of the musicians I have played with over the years, that harmony sure sounds nice. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Emily. That was fantastic. Thank you for your presentation. Folks, as Emily comes to the fore here, do you have questions for her? I don't see anything in the chat, folks.
Lee?
Yes.
Should I go first?
Go for it.
All right. Emily, thanks for the presentation. It's kind of moving in a way. And it reminded me of a musician I interviewed one time who said, the only kinds of musicians I want on my band are the ones who know that they're going to die. And he was coming from a place of Buddhist practice, where the Buddhist teaching is the inevitability of sickness, old age, and death, and the necessity to have compassion as a result of that, once you realize that that's what is in store for all of us. So any way you want to respond to that or not, I just thought that's just a comment.
I really appreciate that story. Thank you so much for sharing it. I know my original version of this document had a third story that includes a memory from when I was maybe 12 or 13 in a bluegrass jam circle, and having one of the people I consistently jammed with telling me that he wanted me to play that fiddle tune at his funeral. And being a 12-year-old, very confused why in the fellowship hall of this church on a Monday night, we were discussing the music for my banjo player friend's funeral, and how that isn't unusual in the jam circle. And yet it's something that I don't think we have truly thought about as a part of the music. So.
I had a question, Emily. I've been trying to formulate it here but I remember you contacted me early on, when you were working on your thesis, and it was, from the first, I've been fascinated with this idea. It totally makes sense. Intuitively, I totally see what you're saying. From the first time you described it, I was thinking, of course, I can sense that goes on. But hearing you discuss it today, and I would recommend to you all that her thesis is from UT is up, and you can get a PDF of it, I do believe, Emily.
It is. I hope it is.
I think, yeah, I just downloaded it during your presentation. So
oh, wow. Okay.
You can all access the fuller version of her work. And I haven't read it yet, but I'm wondering if in the larger thesis project, you discuss other forms of disability other than the age, because I think there are some different ways that age plays into people's typologies or reactions to or conceptions of disability.
I do. I actually talk about this idea from 3 different angles. The first being from the idea of how a jam session is just structured, and ideas of social history and knowing each other over periods of time. The second from the perspective of several musicians that I got to talk to and get to know with various disabilities that are all around my age, 2 of which are hearing impaired and 1 of which is blind. And then this is based off of chapter 4, which is where I go into more of the idea of aging. So I do take it from multiple angles, but this has been the one that I have found most powerful to share, because it's something that resonates with almost every musician that has participated in jam sessions that I've talked to.
Oh, absolutely. I second that for sure. And James has a question here. Does the term accessibility have a role in this presentation? How do you think about accessibility based on your work?
Sure. So within the realm of disability studies, accessibility and accommodation have 2 different connotations. Accessibility is an environment that going into it already has everything set up for a diverse body to enter. So we generally use the word accessibility to refer to, say, architecture, a building that has wheelchair ramps and elevators, braille on the signs. Things like that are a part of accessibility. They're in place regardless of who's there. I use the term accommodation because accommodation usually refers to something changing in response to a person's presence. So the jam session really isn't an accessible space in its natural form. If it was just a circle of people playing music, it's not truly accessible. What makes it accommodating is the fact that the circle is flexible depending on who's there, which is why I use the term accommodation rather than accessibility.
Gosh, that brings up so many really fascinating questions to think about how that would work. Bill, you have a question?
I do. I really enjoyed your presentation. My wife's been an interpreter for the deaf for more than 25 years. I have dealt with disabilities all my life. At age 13, I wrecked a truck and took a traumatic brain injury, which slowed me down. And I have dealt with people telling me, you can't do this, you're not going to be able to accomplish it. And that just put more drive behind me to do it. If you've seen my service dog, he came up here a while ago. I don't know if he's laying down here at my feet, but he's always with me. And you was talking about, you know, accommodation and stuff. A lot of times in the jams, you know, you can easily go in there, but there's other times whenever I walk in there with a service dog and it's like, okay, where am I going to sit? You know, and people say, well, okay, he sat over there. No, he's my service dog. He's got to be here with me, you know, and people don't understand it sometimes. I mean, I've been on stages and stuff as well, and he goes up there and he'll lay down at my feet, you know, while I'm singing, playing, whatever. But whenever he's talking about the older people and stuff, one thing I have noticed in the jams and stuff is a lot of times these older people, they have worked hard lives and stuff, and don't you think that maybe some of their skill levels came after putting in a career, you know, and they've actually started learning their instruments and are being able to master them at a greater level after they've put in. Just like me, for instance, they disabled me in 2013. And, you know, until that time, I didn't have the time to sit down and really concentrate on instruments. I was working 2 or 3 jobs. So, I mean, I guess that's kind of a comment in a lot of ways. But
there's definitely that element too. One thing that I noticed was the large percentage of veterans within the jam circle. Easily identifiable by the fact that they were all wearing their little branch of the military hats with the little pins in them, which always, my grandfather had one of those, so it always makes me a little happy when I see those. And then that relationship of either that side of having experience with disability from the perspective of a military aspect, or from many of them worked manual labor jobs and knew people who had been injured in work accidents. But there is this sense that many of them have gotten more into playing their instrument as an older adult. I've played with so many musicians that as in their retirement picked up a banjo for the first time, and getting to watch that progression with people. So there's definitely also that element of having disability be a transitional point into being able to spend the time playing the music that they've long enjoyed listening to.
That's a fascinating thing to think about, that as a possibility rather than I'll out my former bandmate, Graham Sharp, who's now known in the Steep Canyon Rangers. He took up playing the banjo after he was benched. He injured himself playing soccer and could no longer play on the team. And apparently that's when he took up playing the banjo. So we see where that leads. Fascinating stuff. Maybe we could have one or two more quick questions for Emily. Any other thoughts or comments? Yeah, Anna.
Great presentation, Emily. I wanted to ask about, I thought it was really interesting how you said that people in jam sessions were not identifying as disabled, and I was really convinced by your explanation for that. So I wondered if you could say a bit more about if there are alternative ways that they identify in the face of the need for these accommodations related to hearing impairment and perhaps other things as well. Do they identify as aging? And if so, what does that imply? What does that world mean in this context?
So the primary terminology that I've heard is people complaining about being old, specifically as my experience has been first as a teenager and now as a 20-something in a jam circle. The comments to me about their limitations tend to be reflective of our age discrepancy, and them often reminding me to be thankful for my usefulness as they tell me about the issues that they're experiencing as they age. So I'd say the most common identity is just, oh yeah, I'm old. That said, there's definitely, even within that, different categories. I don't want to say categories. There's a separation between those who are in their younger retirement years and are often traveling to bluegrass festivals and getting to engage in a more active fashion, and those who are towards the end of their life, who come to the session and have their guitar with them, may or may not play, but still love the music, still love attending. And yet, throughout that spectrum, you still see this idea of limitation, but denying the word disability.
Well, I think this is a line of thinking that is really promising. I think we hear a lot of people talk about the importance of the arts as all sorts of things, but I think the inquiry in the arts can help us to find these things that can possibly have really wide-reaching social consequences or benefits, I think. And this is a really fascinating case of that for sure. So I look forward to hearing where your work takes you, Emily, and I'm looking forward to more things that you publish and get out in the world. This is good stuff. Same to all the rest of you all. Hunter and Chloe and John, this has been a really exciting panel. I'm really grateful to your work to make this happen, especially making the videos and everything, getting them up. And I'm so grateful we actually got through everything today. And thank you all for joining us and sticking with this panel. And thanks again to Nancy Cardwell, to Fred, and the Bluegrass Foundation for continuing to sponsor this. We've been doing it since 2017. And really grateful to the IBMA as well, which continues to keep these kind of conversations as part of the conference. Nancy, did you want to say anything else before we wrap up?
No, I was say thank you. Thanks for all your work. I really enjoyed the presentation.
Well,
we should
likewise.
keep doing this. Yeah.
All right. I agree. All right. Well, thanks, folks. Stay in touch. We look forward to more of these kind of events in the future. We'll try and let everybody know. All right. Thanks again.